My son's wife tried to kick me out of my house after my son died, so I got the paperwork done and kicked her out. My son hadn't been dead 2 weeks when his wife stood in my kitchen, hands on her hips, and told me I needed to start packing. That this house was hers now. Her voice didn't tremble, not even a little. I don't know what hurt more, my son's death, or how fast she tried to erase me. I stood there, holding the same tea towel I'd used to wipe tears from my face just that morning, and for a moment, I thought I hadn't heard her right. I asked her to repeat herself, gently, not because I didn't understand, but because I hoped she'd realize how cruel she sounded. She didn't. If anything, she leaned in closer and said, slower, "It's time, Ellen. I need this space to move on with my life." My name in her mouth felt like venom. "I should tell you first who I am. My name is Ellen, and I'm 71 years old. I've lived in this house for over 40 years. My husband, Richard, and I bought it when we were still dreaming about our future. We raised our son, Daniel, here. We planted the pear tree in the backyard the spring after he was born. I cooked Sunday dinners in this kitchen while he did his homework at the table. I can still see the little pencil marks on the wall in the hallway, tracking how tall he grew, year after year. Daniel was everything to me. He was the kind of boy who would come home after school and ask how my day was. He was never too old to hug me, not even when he turned 45. And then, just like that, he was gone. A heart attack. Sudden, brutal. No warning. No goodbye. He left behind his wife, Tasha. They'd been married 6 years. She was his second wife, polite, pretty, careful with her words. But I never felt warmth from her. She smiled the way people smile in photographs, all surface and no soul. Still, I tried. I told myself Daniel loved her, and that was enough for me. But after the funeral, something shifted. Tasha changed overnight. She stopped pretending. She took off the mask. She didn't cry at his service. Not once. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, but it was dry every time. She looked more irritated than heartbroken. I remember watching her during the eulogy, noticing how she kept checking her phone and thinking, "What are you waiting for?" I didn't have to wait long to find out. 3 days later, she started making little comments. "This house must be so full of memories," she said, running her fingers along the mantel like she was already imagining it painted a different color. "I'm sure it'll be good for both of us to get a fresh start." I told her I wasn't going anywhere. That's when she got cold, distant. I heard her on the phone in the hallway late at night, whispering to someone. A lawyer, I guessed. I never eavesdropped. I didn't want to believe what I already felt in my bones. Then, that morning in the kitchen, her words were no longer hints. They were orders. "I'm Daniel's widow," she said. "Everything that was his is now mine. That includes this house." I could feel my pulse in my neck, hot and furious. My knees wobbled, but I stood my ground. "This house," I said slowly, "is in my name. Always has been." She laughed. She actually laughed. "Oh, Ellen," she said, "you're confused. You're grieving. You probably don't remember what Daniel told me. He promised we'd have this house. He told me it would be ours." I walked away before I said something I couldn't take back. But inside, something solidified. A quiet kind of rage. Not the firestorm kind that burns and fades, but the kind that gets cold and clean. I knew what I had to do. I went upstairs to the study and opened the locked cabinet. I hadn't touched that file in years, but I knew exactly where it was. The deed. The original paperwork. My name. Just mine. Not Daniel's, not Richard's, mine. We never transferred ownership, even after Richard died. Daniel never asked. He didn't need to. He respected it was still my home. I sat there with that folder in my lap and let the truth settle like dust in a quiet room. Tasha had no claim, no right, just a fantasy built on assumptions. But I also knew she wouldn't go quietly. People like her, they don't apologize. They don't retreat. They double down. So I called my lawyer. His name is Frank, and he's been handling my affairs since Richard passed. He picked up on the first ring. "Ellen?" he said, voice low and warm. "I was just thinking of calling to check on you. How are you holding up?" "I need to talk to you about the house," I said. My voice didn't shake. "It's urgent." I could hear the shift in his tone. "Come in tomorrow morning. We'll take care of it." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the creaks of the old house, the same ones Daniel used to say were just the house settling when he was a boy. The hallway light spilled under my door like a knife blade. I could hear Tasha moving around, packing boxes that weren't hers to pack. I thought of every meal I'd cooked in this kitchen, every birthday candle blown out, every scar on the wooden floor, every chipped tile, every photo frame. This house wasn't just wood and plaster. It was memory, grief, love, and time. And she wanted to evict me, like I was some kind of guest. I didn't cry, not once. Not even when I heard her tell someone over the phone, "She'll be out by the end of the week. I've already picked out the new paint colors." Let her paint, I thought. Let her decorate it in her mind, because by the time I was done, she wouldn't have a single wall to call her own. I sat in Frank's office the next morning, a thick manila folder clutched in my hands like a lifeline. The sun was barely up, and I had barely eaten. My tea had gone cold twice, untouched, my mind too busy turning over every moment of the last week like jagged stones in my hand. Grief had become background noise, the steady hum of pain I didn't yet have the room to feel, because something else had taken over. Survival. Frank looked older than I remembered. Maybe we both did. Grief does that to people. It ages you in days, not years. He was gentle when he took the folder from me and flipped it open. I watched his eyes scan the documents, watched the small furrow form between his brows as he read. "This is all in your name," he said, finally. "You're the sole owner? Daniel was never added to the deed?" "No," I said. "Richard and I bought the house together. When he passed, it transferred to me automatically. Daniel never asked to be on the title. He didn't want to complicate anything." Frank nodded slowly. "Then she doesn't have a claim, not a legal one at least." "But she thinks she does," I said. "She's telling people she's moving in. She's already making changes. I caught her measuring the front room for new furniture." Frank looked up, startled. "She's still in the house?" I nodded. She never left after the funeral. She moved into Daniel's old room the next day. "Have you told her she needs to leave?" I exhaled. "Not directly. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. I didn't want her turning this into some kind of drama I wasn't prepared for." He leaned back in his chair, interlocking his fingers. "Then let's get you prepared." What followed was a quiet hour of paperwork and planning. Frank explained what I already suspected, that legally she had no right to occupy my home, not without a will or shared ownership. There was no will. Daniel hadn't gotten around to updating it after their marriage. Everything defaulted to me as his next of kin. Not that the house was ever his to begin with. We would draft a formal notice, give her a limited number of days to vacate. If she didn't comply, we'd proceed with legal eviction. It sounded simple when Frank said it. Procedural, clinical. but I knew the emotional minefield waiting for me back at home. When I left his office, I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes before I started the engine. The steering wheel was cold under my fingers. Outside, the world kept moving. Cars, pedestrians, life. It felt strange to be surrounded by motion when so much inside me had gone still. I drove back slowly, not wanting to arrive too soon. The house looked the same as ever when I pulled up, but something about it felt off. It wasn't until I stepped inside that I realized what it was. She'd moved the family photographs, not removed them, just rearranged them, as if testing her claim. My wedding photo had been shifted from the center of the mantel to the far end. The picture of Daniel at his college graduation, the one where he's smiling so wide, his eyes squint into the sun, was no longer in the living room. I found it later, placed face down in a drawer. The kitchen smelled like lavender-scented cleaner I'd never bought. A new throw pillow, all glossy gold sequins, sat on the couch where my old quilt used to be. Small changes, tiny invasions, but each one felt like a needle in the skin. She was marking territory, and worse, she was pretending she already owned it. I didn't say anything that day. I didn't confront her. I went about my business with a quiet, deliberate calm. That evening, I cooked myself dinner and left her to her frozen meals. She didn't say a word to me, just stayed in her room with the door closed, music playing too softly to identify. It was a strange kind of standoff, one made of silence, not shouting. But I was documenting everything. Frank had advised me to keep records, every interaction, every change she made, every time she entered a room that wasn't hers or touched something she had no right to touch. So I kept a journal. I wrote in it each night with a pen that trembled only a little. March 4th. Tasha moved the photo albums from the den, found them stacked on the dining table. March 5th. She took down Daniel's old football trophy, said it collected dust. I placed it back. March 6th. She asked me if I'd consider moving in with some friends. I told her I had no such plans. That same night, I caught her in the attic. She jumped when I opened the door, then laughed like it was all innocent. "Just looking for some space," she said. "This house has so much potential." I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just stared at her until she walked past me, down the stairs, like a guilty child caught snooping. It was surreal, living under the same roof as someone who was actively plotting to push me out. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make scenes. Everything was subtle. Soft digs, veiled suggestions, strategic silences. I think that was the worst part. If she had screamed, I could have screamed back. But she played the role of the calm, rational woman and painted me as the grieving, unstable old widow who didn't know what was best for herself. I wasn't unstable. I was just quiet. But I wasn't going to stay quiet forever. When Frank sent over the first notice, I printed it on thick white paper and placed it in an envelope. I waited until Saturday morning. She was in the kitchen again, stirring a cup of coffee she hadn't offered to me. The smell of her perfume, something sharp and sweet, like syrup turned sour, filled the room. I set the envelope on the table between us. "What's this?" she asked, not looking at me. "Read it," I said. She opened it with a single finger, slow and deliberate. Her eyes moved across the page, and for the first time since Daniel's death, I saw something real flicker across her face. Not grief, not grace. Fear. "This isn't legal," she said. "It is. You can't just throw me out." "I'm not throwing you out. I'm asking you to leave, formally, with notice, as the owner of this home." She stood there for a long time, her hand clutching the paper like it might turn to ash. Then she turned and walked out of the room. She didn't speak to me the rest of the day, but I heard the click of her suitcase that night. She was planning something. I could feel it, but so was I. The days that followed were quiet, but not the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the kind of quiet that makes you flinch at every footstep, that makes the walls feel like they're leaning in, listening. Tasha didn't speak to me after she read the eviction notice. Not a word, but silence can say plenty. She still moved around the house like she owned it. She still ran the dishwasher at night and left wet towels on the bathroom floor. She still brought in shopping bags and didn't bother telling me what they were for. It was like living with a ghost, except this one wasn't dead, just full of entitlement. I wasn't naive. I knew she wouldn't leave easily. People like Tasha don't walk away without a fight. She was used to getting what she wanted: men, money, comfort. She'd landed Daniel late in his life, after a string of short-lived relationships, and from the beginning, I'd sensed her hunger for stability. Or maybe it was control. Daniel never saw it. He was kind to a fault, eager to believe the best in everyone. When I expressed my concerns, gently, years ago, he said, "Mum, she makes me feel wanted. After what I've been through, isn't that enough?" I didn't push. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have looked deeper, questioned more. But back then, I thought, he's a grown man. He knows his own heart. I just wanted him to be happy. And now he was gone. I felt him most in the evenings. That was always our time. When he was little, he'd curl up beside me after dinner, a book in his hands and his head on my shoulder. When he got older, it was late-night calls, long drives, surprise visits with a bottle of wine and a quiet, "thought I'd stop by." I kept expecting to hear his footsteps on the stairs, his laugh in the hallway. Grief, I was learning, has no manners. It shows up whenever it pleases. But I didn't have time to collapse. I had a legal clock ticking. Frank had given her 14 days. That was the minimum under the law for a non-tenant occupying a home without a lease. After that, we'd file for unlawful detainer. A hearing would be scheduled. A judge would rule. And then, if needed, a sheriff would come. It all sounded so sterile, so measured, but none of it captured the deep rot that had settled into the house. Because while I waited, Tasha began to escalate. It started small. One morning, I came downstairs and found the stove burners all turned to high. No flame, just gas. I hadn't touched them. She claimed she hadn't either. "Must be faulty," she said, flipping her hair and sipping orange juice. The next day, my bedroom door was mysteriously stuck. Not locked, jammed. I had to call a neighbor to help me push it open from the hallway. Tasha watched from the bottom of the stairs, arms folded, not offering to help. I started locking my door at night. Then came the missing mail. A bill I'd been expecting never arrived. When I asked her if she'd seen it, she just blinked slowly and said, "You know, maybe it's time to switch to digital. Old habits die hard." She wasn't subtle. She didn't care to be. I documented everything. Frank had given me a small recorder to keep on me in case of confrontation, and I used it when I could, discreetly, carefully. Every petty sabotage, every passive-aggressive slight, every undermining smile. I wrote it all down. Not because I needed revenge, because I needed truth. Then one night, I found her in my bedroom. She hadn't heard me come in. I'd returned early from the grocery store, and I stood there in the doorway, frozen. She was rifling through my nightstand drawer. My private things. Not money, not valuables, just the small, sacred things a woman keeps to herself. Old letters, photographs, a rosary from my grandmother, a letter from Daniel on my 60th birthday, written in his messy, beautiful script. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp. She startled, turned fast, tried to cover it up. "I thought this was the linen closet," she said, too quickly. "I was looking for extra sheets." "In my locked drawer?" She straightened, tossed her hair again. "Don't flatter yourself. There's nothing here I want." But she wanted something. She was looking for leverage, maybe documents, maybe a will she thought Daniel had hidden away, maybe proof I'd forgotten to protect myself. Too bad for her. I hadn't. "I want you out of my room," I said. She walked past me, but not before pausing in the doorway. "You really think you're going to win?" she said. "You think the court will side with you, some lonely old woman in a dusty house?" "This isn't about winning," I said. "It's about what's right." She laughed, low and cruel. "Right is whatever you can prove." But I could prove it. The next morning, I filed the formal eviction paperwork. Frank came with me to the courthouse. We stood in line behind a couple arguing over rent, a college kid with headphones on, and a woman sobbing quietly into a sleeve. Everyone in that hallway was fighting to be heard. When our turn came, the clerk took our papers and stamped them with the mechanical finality of the state. "Your hearing will be in 12 days, she said. "You'll get the notice by mail." 12 days. That was all I had to wait. But those 12 days stretched like wire across my chest. Tasha knew something was coming. I didn't tell her, but she felt it. She became restless. She started leaving the house more often, returning with shopping bags and cold takeout. She spent long hours on the phone in her bedroom, voice hushed. I could hear my name through the wall. She's not going to let it go. No, she thinks she's clever. If I have to, I will fight. I stopped eating dinner in the kitchen. I started keeping a kitchen knife in the nightstand drawer. I'm not a paranoid woman, but there's something about living with a snake in human skin that changes you. You start sleeping lighter. You start checking the locks twice. You stop assuming anyone's acting in good faith. I thought often about Daniel during those nights. What he would say if he saw what she was doing, if he would still defend her, if he would believe me. It hurt to wonder, because he wasn't here to answer. All I had left was my memory of him, and it was getting harder to separate the man I knew from the mistakes he left behind. On the 10th day, 2 nights before the hearing, something happened that still makes my stomach twist. I woke up to the smell of smoke. Not fire, not flames, but something burnt, acrid, sharp. I rushed downstairs, heart pounding, and found the microwave door hanging open, a scorched black mess inside. A pot holder, deliberately placed, charred and smouldering. The kitchen window had been cracked open. The smoke alarm had been disabled. Tasha stood nearby, her arms crossed. "You could have burned the house down," I said, stunned. "Relax," she said. "It was a mistake." It wasn't. She didn't deny it. I called Frank the next morning, and he urged me to stay somewhere else until the hearing. "Ellen," he said, "you're not safe with her in that house. Not anymore." But I refused to leave, not because I was brave, because I was angry. This was my house, my memories, my life. She had taken enough from me already, and in 2 days she was going to lose everything she thought she'd stolen. The morning of the hearing came wrapped in a kind of stillness that didn't feel like peace, but more like the hush before a storm. That dense, watchful silence where every sound feels amplified, every movement laced with meaning. I rose early, not because I needed the time, but because sleep had become a stranger to me in recent days. I moved through the house like a visitor in a museum of my own life, noticing things I'd walked past 1,000 times. The crack in the hallway baseboard Richard once promised to fix. The faded handprint Daniel had left on the garage door when he was 12 and muddy from soccer practice. Every object held memory, like water holds light. Tasha didn't come out of her room that morning. I could hear her pacing, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in short, impatient bursts. She was preparing herself, I imagined, practicing the version of events she would present in court. The polished narrative she'd crafted, the lies she would tell with a perfectly composed face. I didn't expect her to show remorse, and I certainly didn't expect her to walk away without resistance. What I hadn't yet anticipated, though, was the deep and persistent ache that came with realizing that this woman, who once claimed to love my son, now saw me not as a grieving mother, not even as a human being, but as an obstacle to be cleared. Frank picked me up just after 8. He drove an old sedan that smelled faintly of aftershave and the paper files of a man who had spent most of his life in offices. He didn't talk much during the ride, and I was grateful for the silence. My mind was a river, wide and fast, carrying years of memories and regret and quiet, coiled strength. I thought of Richard, what he might have said, what he would have done. And I thought of Daniel, and how proud he had been the day he handed me the keys to his first car and said, "I wouldn't have anything without you, Mum." That moment felt like a ghost sitting beside me now. The courthouse was small and stern-looking, built decades ago and untouched by time, except for the way its walls had yellowed slightly with age. We were directed to a courtroom that smelled of disinfectant and wood polish, the air overly conditioned, as if the building itself was trying to rid itself of human heat and emotion. Tasha arrived 10 minutes later, dressed in a fitted navy suit that looked expensive and too crisp for mourning. She didn't acknowledge me. Her expression was perfectly neutral, her posture impeccable, her presence hollow. The judge was a middle-aged woman with eyes that saw through performance. Her gaze flicked from Tasha to me, then settled on the paperwork. She reviewed it quietly, lips barely moving, nodding slightly as she read. Frank stood and spoke first, calmly, clearly, laying out the facts with the authority of a man who knew the weight of truth. He presented the deed, the records, the legal timeline. There was no drama in his voice, only precision. When Tasha's turn came, she stood with calculated composure, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her voice soft and tinged with just enough sadness to seem genuine to someone who didn't know better. She spoke about her marriage to Daniel, about her supposed understanding that the house was meant to become their family home, about the emotional duress she'd experienced after his death. She never looked directly at me, as if acknowledging me would weaken her illusion. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, the edges of my fingernails digging into my palms. I didn't interrupt. I didn't flinch. When the judge asked me if I had anything to say, I stood slowly, carefully, and met her eyes with every ounce of quiet strength I had left. "I understand grief," I said, my voice clear but steady, not harsh. "I've been living with it every hour of every day since I lost my son. But grief does not grant ownership. This house was never hers. It was mine long before she entered our lives, and it remains mine now. What she's done in the days since his passing, the deception, the manipulation, the threats, none of it has been about mourning. It has been about control, and I will not surrender the only thing I have left of the life I built." There was a pause after I finished. Not long, but long enough to feel like a shift had occurred in the room. The judge nodded once and turned back to the file. After a few more questions and clarifications, she concluded that Tasha had no legal claim to the property, that she had overstayed her welcome, and that the court would issue a formal order for her to vacate the premises within 7 days. Just like that. Quietly. Firmly. It was over. Tasha didn't speak as we left the courtroom. She didn't scream, didn't argue. But I saw the crack in her poise, just for a moment. A tightening around the eyes. A tremor at the corner of her mouth. The performance was faltering, and behind it I saw something smaller. Not fear, not sadness, but a bitter recognition that she had underestimated me. Back home, the house felt different. Still burdened by memory, yes, but also lighter, as though it had exhaled for the first time in weeks. Tasha returned only briefly. She was entitled to collect her belongings before the deadline. And I stayed out of her way as she moved through the rooms like a stranger, packing silently, avoiding my gaze. It was during that time that I found a small notebook tucked between the couch cushions, one I hadn't seen before. It wasn't mine. Inside, in neat, curling handwriting, were notes, not about Daniel, not about grief, but lists of possessions, plans for renovation, names of contractors, dated 2 days after his funeral. It made my stomach turn. This had never been about loss for her. It had been about gain. And now, that gain was gone. When she left for the final time, she didn't say goodbye. She closed the door behind her with a softness that felt performative, like one last attempt at dignity. I watched from the upstairs window as her car pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street, carrying with it the last trace of her presence. I didn't cry. Instead, I walked slowly through each room of the house, touching the backs of chairs, the corners of shelves, the photographs she had tried to hide. I breathed in the scent of lemon oil and old wood and the faint perfume of memory. This house had survived storms, arguments, sickness, loss. It had held my entire adult life between its walls. And now, once again, it was mine, not just in name, but in peace. For the first time in weeks, I slept without fear. In the days that followed Tasha's final departure, the house did not immediately return to what it had been. Memory, I discovered, does not unspool backward on command, and the presence of someone who has tried to erase you doesn't simply vanish once their body walks out the door. There were traces of her everywhere, not just in the physical objects she'd left behind, but in the atmosphere itself, as if her intent had seeped into the walls. I found her perfume clinging faintly to the curtain in the guest room. I came across a single earring wedged into the living room rug, its cold metal catching the light like an accusation. There were emails on the shared desktop computer, bold, casual messages she'd exchanged with friends while still pretending to mourn, filled with words like opportunity and pivot and timing. I opened them slowly, one by one, not because I wanted to punish myself, but because I needed to see it fully. I needed to understand how thoroughly she had positioned my grief as a weakness she could exploit. It was in reading those messages that I understood something I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. She had never truly loved Daniel, not in the way people love with their whole hearts. She had loved what he represented: a man with stable income, a paid-off house, a grieving mother she likely assumed was too weary, too broken, too passive to resist. It stung, even more than I expected. Not just because of her betrayal, but because I had allowed myself to believe, even briefly, that she might have been simply misguided, overtaken by grief, or confused by entitlement. But this was premeditated, methodical. I had been a target. Nothing more. I boxed up what she left behind, Not out of obligation, but out of necessity. Her clothes still hung in the closet Daniel had once used as a teenager, and folding them one by one felt like performing an exorcism with my hands. I didn't smell them. I didn't wonder who she had worn them for. I simply placed them into bags and drove them to the donation center on the edge of town, not even waiting for a receipt. I also went through Daniel's things, slowly and reverently, as if touching them too quickly might wake some sleeping pain. There was a letter he had written to himself at 25. I remembered when he did it, part of some New Year's ritual encouraged by a self-help book he had half finished. He'd sealed it in an envelope marked "Open at 40." He hadn't lived to see that year. I read the letter in the stillness of my bedroom, sitting on the same quilt he'd pulled up around his chin when he had the flu as a child. The letter was short and hopeful, full of little promises and tentative plans. "I hope you've taken Mom to Italy by now," he wrote, "and that you still feel excited when you see Tasha walk into a room." That line sat heavy on my chest. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the fireproof box beneath my bed, where I kept everything too sacred to display. I began reordering the house in small ways, not to erase the past, but to reclaim it. I moved my favorite chair back to its old spot near the window, where I could watch the birds gather on the telephone wires in the early morning. I took down the cold, abstract art Tasha had bought and rehung the embroidered piece my sister had made me 30 years ago, a line of ducks in flight, stitched with quiet precision. I began baking again, filling the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon and butter and the simple comfort of something warm rising in the oven. Neighbors began stopping by again. Word had gotten around, as it always does in small towns, and there were plenty of people who hadn't known what to say during the funeral, but now felt compelled to reappear with store-bought cakes and hesitant condolences. I accepted them with grace, not because I needed the sweets, but because I understood that gestures, even awkward ones, are a form of love when words fail. One afternoon, my friend Jean came by with her garden gloves still on, smelling faintly of rosemary and dirt. She stood on my porch, holding a small pot of thyme, and looked at me with a gentleness I hadn't realized I missed. "I heard," she said simply. "You did the right thing." I invited her in, and we drank tea in the kitchen, and I told her everything. Not all at once, but slowly, over the course of hours. I described Tasha's coldness, the lies, the fear I'd lived with while pretending to be composed. Jean listened, nodding now and then, her hands wrapped around the mug like it was the only thing keeping her still. "You're stronger than you think," she said when I finished. "But I think you've always been." That night, I walked through the house barefoot, feeling the coolness of the floor beneath my feet, and letting the silence finally be mine. No more measured steps, no more holding my breath. I took my time climbing the stairs, pausing to rest my hand on the banister Daniel had once slid down with reckless joy, years before either of us had imagined funerals or courtrooms or women like Tasha. In my room, I lit a single candle on the nightstand. Not for any religious reason, but because I wanted the soft flicker of something alive beside me. I opened the window slightly, letting in the night air, which carried the scent of the neighbours' lilacs and the distant hum of a train passing somewhere in the valley. I knew this wasn't the end of grief, that it would come again, in unexpected moments, in old songs on the radio or the feel of a certain flannel shirt. But I also knew, perhaps for the first time, that I had not been defeated by it. I had been reshaped, tempered. And Tasha, whatever story she told herself to make sense of her loss, no longer had a place in mine. I had imagined that, once Tasha was gone and the legal dust had settled, I would feel something akin to triumph. I thought perhaps there would be a moment where I'd look around the house and feel victorious, like I had taken back what was mine with the clarity and force of a woman unwilling to be erased. But the truth was quieter, far more human. What I felt, mostly, was tired. Not the kind of tired a good night's sleep could mend, but the deeper kind. The bone-deep fatigue that comes after weeks of holding your breath, waiting for the next violation, the next small act of cruelty masked as civility. When she was finally gone, it was not a rush of vindication that filled me, but a long, low exhale, like I had been holding a scream in the back of my throat for weeks and could now, at last, let it dissolve into silence. But silence, I soon discovered, is not the same as peace. There were days when I moved through the house without direction, caught somewhere between grief and aimlessness. The quiet that had once felt sacred now settled over me like a fog, heavy and directionless. I missed Daniel with an ache that had grown more precise with time, not softer, exactly, but sharper in its clarity. I missed the way he called me Ma when he wanted to be endearing. I missed the way he took his coffee. Too much cream, always. I missed the presence of someone who had known me before I became a widow, before I became someone another woman could look at and decide was disposable. One afternoon, I opened his closet. Not because I had planned to, but because I'd walked past it for weeks, always pausing, always retreating. That day, something told me to open the door. Inside, his clothes hung just as he'd left them. Pressed shirts from his job at the firm, a weathered leather jacket I remembered from his college years, shoes lined neatly along the floor, as if he might return for them any moment. I didn't cry. I reached in and pulled out the jacket, pressing it to my face. It still smelled faintly of him, of the cologne he wore sparingly, of wind and city air, and something unmistakably him. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let the weight of it settle across my lap. The fabric creased in ways that remembered the shape of his shoulders. Later that evening, I began sorting through his things, not to get rid of them, but to place them in order. I couldn't bring myself to throw anything away, not yet, but I began organizing, storing what needed protection, folding what should be preserved. In a small wooden box, tucked behind a row of paperbacks, I found a photograph I hadn't seen in years. Daniel, maybe 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on the front lawn, holding a paper sign that read, "This is my home forever." It had been part of a school project, something about what home meant to us. I remembered helping him write the letters on that sign, guiding his small hand as he pressed the marker too hard and bled the ink through the paper. He had been so proud of that photo, insisting we put it on the fridge until it curled at the corners and faded in the sun. Looking at it now, I felt a deep, sudden swell of resolve. This was his home, and mine. Not hers. Never hers. That photograph now sits in a frame on the mantel, beside the urn that holds his ashes. In the weeks that followed, I found myself rejoining the world in slow, tentative steps. I began attending the Wednesday morning book club at the library. A small group of women, most of them retired, who discussed novels and sipped over-steeped tea, and sometimes, when the conversation drifted, shared fragments of their lives with startling honesty. At first, I didn't say much. I listened. I watched. I tried to remember what it was to speak in a room where no one expected me to defend my existence. But then, during one discussion about a novel involving betrayal within a family, I found myself speaking, slowly at first, then with more certainty. I didn't name Tasha. I didn't describe the legal details. But I spoke of losing someone you love, and the quiet horror of being treated like an afterthought in the house you built, and the way justice, when it finally comes, isn't loud or triumphant, but still and patient, like breath returning to lungs that had forgotten how to expand. The room went quiet, not in judgment, but in recognition. Heads nodded. A few eyes welled with understanding. I realized then that pain is a currency many of us carry, and sometimes all it takes is the willingness to show the bill for others to show theirs. It didn't heal me, but it began to connect me to something beyond myself, a thread of shared womanhood, of survival, of quiet endurance. Frank called one morning not long after that meeting, just to check in. His voice, always calm and deliberate, carried a warmth I hadn't noticed before. "How are you adjusting?" he asked. I told him the truth, that I was adjusting, slowly, that the house felt different now, not haunted exactly, but still echoing with things unsaid, that some days I woke up and felt like myself, and other days I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror at all. "That's part of it," he said. "Grief changes shape, but so do we." I thanked him, not just for his help with the legal battle, but for believing me when I said something was wrong, before anyone else had been willing to hear it. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the sunroom, watching the light filter through the glass, dancing across the floor in soft, golden waves. The pear tree Daniel had helped me plant decades ago was in bloom again, the delicate white blossoms fluttering like paper promises. I opened the window and let the scent drift in, clean and faintly sweet. In that moment, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken either. I simply felt like a woman who had endured something and was still standing. Not because I had won a battle, but because I had refused to disappear. Spring deepened, and with it, something in me began to settle, not in resignation, but in renewal. The house, for all its shadows and echoes, slowly started to feel less like a place where something had been lost, and more like a place where something enduring still lived. I took long walks in the early mornings, the kind where the dew clings to your shoes and the air feels clean enough to start over. With every quiet footstep along the gravel path near the old mill road, I felt as if I were walking back into myself, piece by piece, from the edges inward. For so many weeks, I had lived in a state of quiet defense, always alert, always watching, even when I pretended not to be. But now, for the first time since Daniel's death, I was beginning to look forward instead of simply enduring each day. There were moments, short, flickering ones, when I caught myself humming as I folded laundry or hummingbirds darted past the kitchen window and made me smile before I could stop myself. These were not grand signs of healing, but they were real. Still, there were scars. One afternoon, while clearing out the last of the storage boxes in the attic, I found a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper, tucked at the bottom of an old suitcase. At first, I didn't recognize it. But as I unwrapped the fragile layers, a slip of paper fell out, in Daniel's handwriting. For the future, if needed. Inside the bundle was a flash drive. I stared at it for a long time before bringing it downstairs. I didn't know what it would contain, or whether I wanted to know. Part of me feared it would be another bruise, more pain, more unfinished business. But curiosity, and something deeper than that, maybe instinct, guided me. I plugged it into the desktop and opened the only folder on it, titled simply, Legal Notes. There were several documents, scans of contracts, receipts, and one video file. With trembling fingers, I opened the video. Daniel sat in the frame, wearing one of his button-down shirts, sleeves rolled up, looking into the camera with a seriousness that made my heart constrict. He was older than I remembered him in most home videos, maybe recorded just a few months before he died. The background was his office, the books behind him slightly out of focus. He ran a hand through his hair before speaking. "If you're watching this," he said, "something's gone wrong." My breath caught in my throat. He continued, voice calm but deliberate, as if he had rehearsed it many times before recording. He spoke about his assets, about Tasha's behavior that had begun to trouble him. Nothing dramatic, but specific enough to raise concern. He mentioned conversations he'd had with colleagues, inconsistencies in things she told him, and the way she became defensive any time he talked about updating his will or transferring the house. "I didn't put her on the deed," he said. "And I didn't, because I had doubts. I loved her, or I tried to, but I think she loved what being with me gave her. There's a difference." He paused, looking down for a moment. "If Mom's watching this, if something happened to me, and she's the one left cleaning up the pieces, I want her to know. She was right to be careful. I should have listened sooner." He ended the video there, abruptly, as though anything more would be too painful to say. I sat back in the chair, hands clasped tightly in my lap, and let the silence absorb me. It wasn't just vindication I felt, though yes, there was some of that, but a swell of sorrow that Daniel had lived with doubt and hadn't said anything until it was too late. It pained me to think he had carried that uncertainty alone, but even in death, he had left me a gift, the truth, and with it, closure. I shared the contents of the flash drive with Frank, who was stunned, not by the evidence itself, the legal battle was already over, but by the clarity of Daniel's intent. He offered to archive the documents formally, just in case, he said, though we both knew the only battle now was with memory. The video, though, I kept. I moved it to a secure folder on my own computer, labeled simply Daniel 2024, and I've only watched it once since. Not because I fear it, but because I don't want it to become a crutch. He had spoken his truth. I had heard it. That was enough. Around that time, I began volunteering at the local historical society. It was something I had thought about for years but never pursued, always too busy with work, with family, with tending to the everyday demands of life. But now, I found myself drawn to the quiet rhythm of archiving. There was something deeply comforting about organizing old photographs, labeling maps, transcribing the delicate cursive of forgotten letters. One afternoon, while cataloguing a stack of century-old birth records, I found myself thinking about legacy. Not the grand kind that gets written into textbooks, but the personal kind, the kind that lives in careful handwriting, in photographs slipped into family Bibles, in recipes passed down without measurements. I thought of Daniel, and how his legacy wasn't a matter of money or real estate. It was in the way he used to kneel when talking to small children so they could look him in the eye. It was in the way he held doors open without thinking, and how he once drove 3 hours out of his way to help a friend's mother change a tire. Those things would never be written down, but they lived in the people who remembered him. They lived in me. One of the women at the Historical Society, a widow named Ruth, invited me to a community potluck. I almost said no. Social events still made me uneasy, the thought of small talk exhausting. But something in her expression reminded me of myself. I agreed to come. The night of the potluck, I wore a deep blue sweater Daniel had once given me and brought a casserole I hadn't made in years, the kind with too much cheese and no apologies. The community hall was warm and bustling, filled with the low hum of voices, the clatter of serving spoons, the smell of every childhood kitchen I'd ever known. People smiled. People asked about my garden. People remembered Daniel, not as a tragedy, but as someone who once laughed too loudly at a church picnic and always brought extra ice to neighborhood barbecues. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was trying to rejoin the world. I felt like I belonged in it. By the time summer began to press its full weight into the days, that soft, honeyed heat that makes every sound seem to arrive more slowly, I had begun to feel something I had not dared name in a long while: contentment. Not the glittering, euphoric kind that surges up in joyful bursts, but something quieter, steadier, like the sound of leaves rustling when there is no wind, only memory moving through them. Life, I found, was rebuilding itself around me, not in dramatic ways, but in the small things that asked for my attention. The way the pear tree's fruit came in late that season, heavy and golden and almost too sweet. The sound of children playing 3 houses down, their shrieks of laughter tumbling through the afternoon air like wind chimes gone wild. I began to greet the mailman by name. I learned to make lentil soup from scratch. I bought myself a new set of bed sheets, not because the old ones were worn, but because I wanted to. It was a strange thing, living a life no longer shaped by resistance. For months, I had existed in a state of defense, every part of me braced against intrusion, always preparing for the next erosion of dignity or space. Now, without that pressure, I had to relearn how to simply be. I did not expect how difficult that would be at first. There were mornings when I still walked through the hallway slowly, half expecting to see a door ajar that I hadn't left open. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of my reflection, and, for just a moment, expect it to look older, more damaged, as though the suffering should have left marks deeper than time alone would create. But what I saw, instead, was a woman with lines that had been earned, not inflicted. A woman who, despite everything, had not disappeared. My relationship with the house began to shift in turn. It no longer felt like a contested space. It was mine again, not just legally, but spiritually. I started small projects, some of them long overdue: repainting the kitchen cabinets, replacing the tired curtains in the den, planting lavender along the walkway where the grass had always struggled to grow. These weren't grand renovations, I had no need for spectacle, but they were acts of claiming, gestures of return. One morning, while clearing the last of the clutter from the garage, I came across a dusty, sealed box labelled in Daniel's handwriting. Mum's stuff. Attic. I smiled despite myself. It was his way, always labelling things with a question, as though nothing was ever final, everything still subject to a mother's input. I sat on the workbench and opened it slowly, feeling the dry cardboard give way beneath my fingers. Inside were small pieces of a life I had half forgotten. Photographs from before Daniel was born, letters Richard had written me when we were still dating, brittle with age and folded so many times the creases had begun to wear through. There was a scarf my sister had knitted me during her treatment, a colour I hadn't worn in years, but remembered with such vivid clarity that I could hear her voice in my head, teasing me for always choosing grey over anything bright. There was also, near the bottom, a small wooden music box. When I opened it, the tune was faint and halting, but familiar. A melody from an old lullaby I used to hum when Daniel was very young. I hadn't heard it in decades. It played only a few notes before falling silent, but in those few seconds, I felt as though time had curled back on itself. I closed my eyes and let the stillness hold me. That afternoon, I wrote a letter to Daniel. Not out of grief, not out of desperation, but as a way of speaking to the part of me that still belonged to him. I didn't dramatize. I didn't beg the universe for answers. I simply told him how the house looked now, how the lavender had taken root, how the paint in the kitchen gleamed in the morning light. I told him I had joined the Historical Society, and that Jean still brought me time in little pots, and that the world, for all its sorrow, had begun to feel alive again. I folded the letter and placed it in the music box, letting it rest there like a breath held in wood. I didn't need to read it again. I had said what I needed. Later that week, a letter arrived, a formal one, printed on stiff cream paper with an embossed seal I recognized immediately, the office of the estate attorney. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it, unsure whether I wanted to see what remained of the legal aftermath. Inside, the message was brief. Confirmation that all financial matters regarding Daniel's estate had been concluded, and that as the legal beneficiary, I had full discretion over the remaining assets. A small savings account, a modest life insurance policy. Nothing extravagant, but more than I had expected. Included was a note in the attorney's own hand. "Your son spoke highly of you. I thought you should know that." I sat at the kitchen table, letter in hand, the afternoon light warm against my shoulders, and let those words settle into the space inside me where doubt had once lived. Not because I needed a stranger's validation, but because it reminded me that Daniel had not been blind to what I gave or who I was. It was then I made a decision I had been circling for months, unsure whether I was brave enough to follow through. That weekend, I visited the community centre and signed the paperwork to start a small weekly class. Nothing formal, nothing grand. Just a space for older women in the neighbourhood to gather and talk, to share stories, to teach one another small skills and remember the parts of themselves that had gone quiet in the years since retirement, widowhood, divorce, or just time. I called it the Room of Our Own. The first week, only 3 women came, but the following week there were 5, and the week after, 10. Some came with yarn and knitting needles, some with old journals and tentative memories. One brought watercolour paints, another just listened. But in that room, something precious began to form. A place where women who had been told, in 1,000 subtle ways, that their voices were no longer needed, began to speak again. And I, who had once been nearly erased from my own home, now stood in a room I had built, not of bricks and walls, but of presence, of resilience, of lives continuing. The weeks unfolded slowly, one after another, like pages in a book written in a quieter language, a life no longer dictated by crisis, but shaped by choice. There was a gentleness to the days that surprised me, not because I had never known peace, but because I had forgotten what it felt like when it wasn't stolen from you and then painstakingly reclaimed. In the room of our own, something rare had begun to take root. Not just friendship, but a kind of shared vigilance. We were all women who had endured various losses, some to illness, some to betrayal, others simply to time. There was Martha, who'd spent 30 years caring for a husband who no longer recognized her name by the end, and Evelyn, who had lived with a grown daughter whose addiction had hollowed out their family from the inside, and Ruth, with her clipped speech and fastidious hair, who had never married and never regretted it, but whose brother had taken her family home without asking and left her with nothing but photographs and bitterness. Each of us had our story, and in that softly lit room on the second floor of the community centre, those stories were no longer things we whispered to ourselves in the dark. They became the fabric of our companionship, not wounds to reopen, but truths to share so we could be witnessed, not pitied. One afternoon, as we sat folding paper into little birds, Martha had brought origami instructions as a way of practicing letting go of perfection. I looked around the room and realized how far I'd come from the woman who had once felt too silenced to speak. These women didn't need me to be wise or strong. They just needed me to be present. And that, I found, was the greatest offering any of us had to give. Outside those walls, life kept happening, in its ordinary and sometimes quietly profound way. The neighbour's daughter had her first child, a boy named Oliver, with a dark thatch of hair and a cry that echoed through the summer air like something ancient and holy. I brought over a blanket I had knitted months earlier, not for anyone in particular, just to keep my hands busy. They cried when I gave it to them, said it reminded them of something their grandmother once made. I didn't tell them how healing it was to be useful again. Frank stopped by occasionally, once to return a book I'd lent him on local architecture, once just to say hello. There was something different about him now. We had both gone through something, separately but in parallel, the way people do when one becomes witness to another's pain in a professional context, and then quietly steps into the role of something more enduring. We didn't name it. There was no need. Sometimes all we did was sit on the porch and drink coffee while the sun moved over the pear tree, and that was enough. In early August, I received a letter I hadn't expected, a formal inquiry from a distant cousin of Tasha's, requesting access to any remaining personal effects she might have left behind. The wording was careful, almost sanitized, as if they didn't know the full story, or worse, knew only her version. I read the letter twice before folding it neatly and placing it in a drawer. There was nothing left of hers in this house, and more importantly, there was no part of her left in me. She had tried to erase me, to write herself into the home I had built with my own hands and sacrifices. But all that remained now was the quiet resilience of a woman who had endured her grief and stood through the storm. Not because she was immune to suffering, but because she had refused to become small in the face of it. One night, as summer began to lean toward its end, I hosted the women from our group in my backyard. Just a modest gathering, no decorations or grand gestures. I set out folding chairs beneath the pear tree, laid a table with lemon bars and sweet tea, and let the dusk gather around us like an old friend. We talked and laughed, not about pain that time, but about recipes that had gone wrong, about men we almost married and were glad we hadn't, about the books we'd pretend to have finished when we hadn't read past chapter 3. There was joy in the air, not loud, not performative, but steady and deep, like the sound of a stream under stones. At one point, Ruth, who rarely spoke about anything tender, looked at me and said, not in a loud voice, but in that way that stills a circle of women, "You're not who I thought you were, and I mean that in the best way." I smiled. Neither am I. It was true. I was no longer the Ellen who had accepted silence in her own home, who had moved through grief like a ghost, who had once believed that growing old meant growing invisible. I had learned, through fire and quiet and long afternoons, that sometimes justice is not found in courts or in confrontation, but in presence, in simply continuing to exist, fully and without apology, in the space someone tried to take from you. That night, as the last of the guests trickled out and I gathered the empty glasses from the yard, I stood beneath the pear tree and looked up into its branches. The fruit was nearly ripe, heavy and golden in the fading light. I reached up and picked one, still warm from the day. I bit into it, letting the juice run down my wrist, and I closed my eyes. It tasted like sunlight and home. There is a particular stillness that settles in late September, not the stillness of emptiness, but of conclusion. It's the hush the earth exhales after months of sun and bloom, when even the wind seems to grow tired and the trees begin to let go without protest. That's how it felt inside me as the seasons began to turn again. Not an ending, exactly, but a drawing inward, a kind of peace that asked for no applause. By then, the house had become mine again in every sense, not just on paper or in memory, but in feeling. I no longer moved through it like someone walking across thin ice. The walls did not echo with past threats. The air no longer carried her scent. The home that had once sheltered 3 lives, mine, Richard's, Daniel's, had, in its own quiet way, mourned and breathed through its losses, and now stood steady again, aged but unbroken, like me. There were still moments when memory would catch me unguarded. Daniel's voice in a song on the radio, his handwriting on the inside of a cookbook he once gave me, the faint scent of his aftershave from a coat I hadn't worn since the winter before he died. Grief, I had come to learn, doesn't disappear. It simply learns how to walk beside you without needing to be fed. And Tasha, her absence had become its own kind of healing. Not because I had forgotten, and certainly not because I forgave in any conventional sense, but because she no longer had weight in my world. She had taken so much space in my life without ever truly understanding what she was standing inside. The history, the blood, the layers of love built into the walls she once measured for new curtains. What she wanted was possession. But what this house held was presence, and that she could never claim. One afternoon, I received a message from the estate lawyer, just a brief email informing me that Tasha had moved out of state. No forwarding address, no additional claims or filings, no further correspondence expected. I read the message once, closed my laptop, and returned to my tea. That was all the closure I needed. That weekend, I sat beneath the pear tree again, the same place where I had grieved and raged and mourned. Only now, I brought with me a small stack of notebooks, the journal I had kept through it all, filled with careful, shaky handwriting and notes that now read like field reports from another life. I flipped through the first pages. The day Daniel died, the day Tasha told me to start packing, the list of everything she had touched, moved, or tried to claim. The fear, the fury, the disbelief. I let the words speak for themselves and didn't turn away from any of them. Then I did something I hadn't known I was ready for. I took each page, one at a time, and fed them to the fire pit I had built near the edge of the garden. A small circle of stones Daniel and I had placed together one summer when he was home from college, both of us sweaty and sunburned, and too proud to admit we were exhausted. I watched the pages curl into ash, not as an act of erasure, but of release. The house no longer needed protection. I no longer needed proof. Later that evening, I brought down the last of the boxes I had stored in the attic. They held the remaining photos and belongings from Daniel's old room, the ones I hadn't been able to face, the ones that still smelled faintly of his cologne and sleep. I spent hours sorting them gently, not rushing the memories. I placed some in albums, some in boxes for safekeeping, and a few I set aside to frame. One photo in particular held me. It was from his 30th birthday. We were in the backyard, standing side by side, holding slices of cake and smiling so naturally that it hurt to look at. There was no strain in that smile, no pretending. Just my son and me, whole in a moment I didn't know would one day matter more than any other. I framed that photo and placed it by the front door. Not as a warning to anyone else, but as a reminder to myself that I had known joy, and it had been real. As autumn deepened, I began offering extra sessions of the room of our own. The group had grown, now nearly 20 women, each one of them carrying some story, some invisible scar, some quiet victory. We no longer needed to tell the worst of what had happened. We had moved into another rhythm, one of reclaiming, of dreaming, even of planning. Some of the women started small businesses, others went back to school, or finally applied for passports to visit cities they had only ever read about. We weren't trying to outrun age. We were simply refusing to let it define the boundaries of our lives. One Thursday afternoon, after everyone had gone, I sat in the empty room and allowed the silence to wash over me. I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed in the past year. The woman who'd buried her only child. The woman who'd been nearly erased in her own home. The woman who had sat in court and spoken not out of vengeance, but truth. And now, a woman who had not only survived, but returned. That was the word I kept coming back to. Returned. Not reborn, not rescued, not even healed, but returned to herself, to her name, to the quiet dignity of a life lived on her own terms. In the weeks that followed, I allowed myself more joy. I began writing again, not just in journals, but essays, stories. I bought myself a proper desk and positioned it near the window that caught the morning light. I started baking bread from scratch again, giving loaves to neighbours just because it made me feel connected. I listened to music without flinching. One cold evening, as I sat reading by the fireplace, I thought about something Daniel had once said years ago. I'd been fretting over something: bills, a leak in the roof, the usual weather of a life lived long enough. And he had said, "You don't have to hold everything all the time, Mom. Some things can set themselves down." At the time, I'd brushed it off. But now, sitting there in the warm hush of a home fully mine again, I understood what he meant. You don't have to carry the weight forever. Some things, even pain, will set themselves down if you let them. That night, I slept deeply. No knife in the nightstand. No locks triple-checked. No ghosts waiting behind doors. Just a house at peace, and a woman still alive inside it.